to just recap a little bit about meditation. What we've learned so far in the first 5 lessons about meditation is that the Jewish view of meditation is not an escape into some nirvana island where you're away from everyday worries and challenges and you just live in dreamland and then you come back refreshed. Might be a good thing, but that's not what Jewish meditation is really about. Jewish meditation is being mindful and being able to live in the moment and be able to be focused and thoughtful and calm and directed in what's happening. And the idea of meditation is connected to the word hitbonenut, which means to contemplate in thought, to meditate in thought. We also mentioned in lesson number 2 that it has to do with the word binyan, which means to create. It's to reframe the mind into being able to see things in a proper way. We've learned that it's very mindful to replace negative thoughts with positive thoughts, and they have an effect on us. And finally, we've learned not only about divine providence, but that the divine spark is found in everything, even in the inanimate, not only in the in humans, and not only in animals, and not only in the plant or vegetable kingdom, but even in the inanimate. So everything that's there is an expression of godliness as the godly soul, and we need to actually connect with it. And that takes a lot of meditative practice. We also mentioned that the Mishnah says that the ancient Hasidim would not start praying until they would contemplate in thought at least for an hour before the prayer and even after the prayer. So the davening wasn't just a time to ask and beg. Actually, the davening, the prayer, was a time to connect intellectually and emotionally. So meditation is very important, and we remember that it goes back even to the time of Abraham. So in this lesson, we're actually going to look at meditation in the practical sense. And in order to tackle this, we have a question. And the question is, meditation, which as we've learned until now is a cognitive exercise, but it's also action-oriented. The question that we have is, A, how central is meditation in Jewish life? And obviously, according to what we've studied until now, it's very important. Then there's a question. You can say that Judaism is a religion of action. And we say action speaks louder than words. We're still going to see some more quotes about action. So before we go there, I'd like you to open up your textbook to page 182 and look at the exercise 6.1. And while you do that, somebody sent me a question. Oh, not to me. Okay. So
sorry.
In this exercise, we're going to look at on a scale from 1 to 5. What do you think is central to Judaism? So let's talk about action. Would you say action is very important to Judaism? It's middle important, or it's not that important?
Very important.
And that's not an answer that I want you to give me. I'd rather you answer the question to yourself. The second question is, in other words, let's talk, what do you think are the central tenets of Judaism? And we've chosen 4. One is action, and everybody agrees that action is important. But values, some people say values, that in Judaism, values are very important. The values are having good character trait, treating people properly, having a world of peace. Okay. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to try to, I don't hear it, so I'm going to try to mute all. Yes, I hope that helps. I don't know why I'm not hearing things. I hope that it'll work, but I have not heard anything from anybody. So we would say again, let me just repeat it. For action, action is very important. Values are very important. What about faith? Faith is very important. What about mindfulness? Okay, so now I'm going to ask you to turn to page 183. Let's look at text 1, a very interesting statement in the Mishnah. And we have the short version here. I will orally discuss this with you, what the long version is. But the short version is, the essential thing is not study, but deed. Actually, in another place in the Talmud asked the question. The question that the Talmud raises is, what is more important, study or action? And over there, the Gemara says it a little bit differently than here. Over here, the quotation is that the study is not as essential as the action. Over there, it says the opposite. It says the study is most important. But then it says, you know why? Because the study leads to action. So either which way you slice it, action is the most important thing. So the question that I have on the table for everybody is, do you think that Judaism is a religion of action? That'll be question number 1. And what do people think?
Yes,
Obviously,
I believe
yes.
it is. I believe that it
Because
is.
if you think about the Torah commands us to do mitzvot. Mitzvot are commandments. So in the commandments, there are 613 commandments. Of the 613, 365 are don'ts, and 248 are do's. So the 248 is a pretty big number. Even if you subtract all the mitzvot that are connected to the Holy Temple, we still have plenty of mitzvahs of things that we have to do. So action is very important. So much so that there are a lot of people that have the misnomer and they think that since action is so important, the study is not important. Just give me the bottom line. I don't need to know the philosophy. I don't need to know the theology. I don't need to know the reason why. I just need to do it, and that's it. And everything else is superfluous, is secondary. Which leads us actually to a very interesting discussion in the Talmud. And let me put it forth to you. The Talmud asks the question, do mitzvot need to have kavanah? Do you know what kavanah is? Kavanah is intent. Does a mitzvah need to be done mindful? I'll give you an example. Let's say you have a couple, they're Jewish, and it's the first day of Rosh Hashanah, and it's not a Shabbat, it's a weekday. What is the main mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah? Hearing the shofar. Now, this couple had no intent of going to synagogue whatsoever. They're walking down the street, and actually it's a true story. A girl from Charlotte living in Los Angeles, her father called her before the holiday and said, please, my dear, go to synagogue, it's Rosh Hashanah. And she said, I'm not interested, I want to go to work. And she went to work, and then she took a lunch hour and she walked down the street somewhere near downtown. She suddenly sees a Lubavitch young man walking down the street with a chauffeur, and there were homeless people sitting encamped near the building. And he asks any of each and every one of the homeless people, are you Jewish? Are you Jewish? And finally, one guy says, yeah, I'm Jewish. So he says, you know, there's a mitzvah of hearing the shofar today. And the guy was wearing a baseball cap. So he says, recite the blessing with me. He recited the blessing. and he blew the shofar for this homeless man. And this girl happened just to walk by, and she stopped in her tracks and she listened to it. And she called her dad later and she said, I had my greatest Rosh Hashanah experience. My Rosh Hashanah experience was not in the synagogue, but it was in the street, because I saw the way this young man really cared about this homeless person. But here I'm going to ask you a question. What happens if this couple is walking down the street and they have no intent of going to synagogue, and they walk by a synagogue and they just happen to hear the shofar, but they didn't even intend, it was just a sound to them? Did they fulfill the mitzvah of listening to the shofar or not? So the question that the Talmud poses is, mitzvot tzrichot kavanah or not? Do mitzvahs need kavanah or not? And this is a debate that goes and bleeds through not only in the Talmud, but even in the Rishonim and the great thinkers going back and forth. Now, so in other words, the fact that there is a debate means to say that it doesn't say anywhere explicitly. Where is this law written? This law is written in regards to the reciting of the Shema. As we know, the Shema prayer is one of the most important prayers. What is the translation of the word Shema? Shema Yisrael. Hear, O Israel, God our Lord is one. What does it mean, hear, O Israel? Think. Shema, as it says, comes from hitbonanut. You have to focus your mind so that you should be able to hear what you're saying. The problem is that there are people that do mitzvahs just by rote. They get into the habit, they do it, and they don't think about it anymore. They get up in the morning, they recite certain things, they don't think about it, they say the Shema, and then they question, oh yeah, I said the Shema, but they never really put their mind into it. Comes along the code of Jewish law and says it has to be redone. There are exceptions. The exception is when it comes to charity. If you inadvertently took out cash and gave it to a poor person, even though you didn't intend to give it to them, but they benefited from it, it's a mitzvah. Furthermore, even if you didn't give it to them, the Gemara, the Talmud says that if you walk down the street and some cash fell out or coins fell out of your pocket or your purse onto the floor, and a poor person came down the path a little bit later and picked it up, and it saved their life or it gave them what they need, even though you never knew that you even did it, it's credited to you as a mitzvah. So that's one exception. Now the question is, what are the intent? What is the intent that we're talking about? So this is something we need to examine. If you give a look at page 186, there's an exercise, and it says, choose 2 mitzvot that you did in the past, and try to think the mitzvah you did, and did you have intent, and what was your intent for it? So sometimes you can do it, a mitzvah, there's no intent, and there's action. Sometimes there's intent and action. And when you have action, it brings purpose and it makes the mitzvah. So let me explain this. Every act that we do has a body and has a soul. Just as we physically have a body and a soul, everything in the world has a body and a soul. Even the words you speak have a body and a soul. Even the words that you think have a body and a soul. The body are the words that you're thinking, the soul is the content. The same thing is true with a mitzvah. When you're doing a mitzvah, there's the body of the mitzvah that you're doing, and then there is the intent. The intent is the soul. Now, in the intent, there could be many levels. And we're going to talk about the general level and the particular level, because they're both important. The general level is, it's a commandment from God, and God sanctified us to the mitzvah, so we're fulfilling God's desire. That's the general intent. The particular intent is that each mitzvah has a unique qualifier, that it qualifies and it does something for us, that it refines us. And we're going to go through this lesson and see that and why they're both important. So in order to understand the general idea, we know that the mitzvah is something that God commanded us, and God wants to have a connection. Give a look at text 3 on page 186. It was taken from a discourse from the previous Rebbe. The word mitzvah means a connection, as in the Aramaic term tzavta. Tzavta, actually in Hebrew, there's a little bit of it. It's called a tzevet. A tzevet is a crew. If you go on an airplane, the captain will turn around in Hebrew and say to the co-pilot, "Where's my tzevet? Where's my crew?" Or a captain in the military will say, "Where's my tzevet?" Tzevet, Hebrew and Aramaic are very similar. Why is it called a crew? Because they're all connected together. And tzavta means something that combines together. It's called chibur. So a mitzvah, the word mitzvah not only means a commandment, but it also means a connector, a connection. One who performs a mitzvah bonds with God's very self. For God is the issuer of the commandment. What does this mean with God's very self? The terminology in Hasidus is the following, that when somebody has wisdom, the wisdom is just a manifestation of the soul. Wisdom is the way the soul is intellectual. When someone has emotions, it's the manifestation of the soul on an emotional level. But when someone has a desire, the desire comes from the essence of the soul. Desire doesn't come from wisdom, it supersedes wisdom. Desire supersedes even emotions. Desire comes from the essence. So when God desires a mitzvah, the mitzvah is called the will of God. So that means the essence of God is invested in this mitzvah. So when you're doing a mitzvah, it even has something more powerful than Torah. Because when you're studying Torah, you're studying the wisdom of God. So you're connecting with the wisdom of God. Through that, you connect with the essence of God. But when you're doing the mitzvah, because this is the desire of the essence of God, it's a direct connection with God. So the overall intent in a mitzvah is, with this, I connect with God. This is the significance of our sage's statement, the reward of a mitzvah is a mitzvah. Now think about it. In the Mishnah, it says the following. It says the punishment for a transgression is a transgression, and the reward for a mitzvah is a mitzvah. Now, when you learn it on the simple level, it means to say that when you do one mitzvah, you have an appetite to do another mitzvah. What we're saying here is no, it's not only that, not to negate that you want another mitzvah, but there's something even deeper. When you do one mitzvah, the mitzvah itself is a reward. Why? Because the mitzvah is bonding you with God. The bonding of the mortal forms with the commandment, with the infinite God who issued the commandment, is in itself the greatest reward. In other words, God desired to have a relationship. And the relationship itself, that's the reward. Give you an example. Let's say a husband brings flowers to his wife for the Shabbat. So there are two ways it can happen. One way it can happen is that he conscientiously stops at the florist. And by the way, in Israel, it's a very interesting custom. So many men buy flowers that when you drive down the highway, and I'm not talking about the interstate, but the regular highway, there are flower vendors all over selling all kinds of flowers because they know men want to do that. So you buy flowers and you choose the flowers if you know that your wife likes it. If she doesn't like flowers, you'll choose something else. But I'm using it just for the example. And you mindfully pick it up. And then when you come home, you present it. And why are you presenting it? Because you want to have flowers in the house? Or you just want that she should be happy and not be upset? Why didn't you get me flowers? The ultimate reason is because you want to develop a relationship. That's the way it is whenever you give a gift, or if somebody asks you to do a favor, you're not only doing the favor because you want to feel good, you're doing the favor because this helps the relationship, the bonding cement between people. We do things for each other. That's the way God created the universe. So the purposes for a relationship, there could be that someone just happens to be walking by and somebody in the street puts in your hand a bouquet of flowers. You don't even notice it because you're busy. You're looking at your cell phone, on your smartphone. You walk into your house. Your wife sees the flowers. She takes it from you. So you gave the flowers. But is that called a relationship? You did the act, but it's not a relationship. Because it's not the flowers, it's the relationship. When we think about a mitzvah, it's the relationship that this is what God wanted, so we're doing it for that reason. And that's why you'll find a very interesting statement in the Talmud. Give a look on page 187, text 4. This is taken from the Tanya. This is the inner significance of the blessing prior to doing a mitzvah. Let me stop here. By the way, nowhere in the Torah does it say that you have to recite a blessing for a mitzvah. In fact, the only blessing in the Torah that is a biblical mitzvah is
Grace after meals.
what is the only mitzvah in the Torah that is biblical, that a blessing? There's two. But one is for the Kohanim, the priestly blessing, and the other one is for us.
Grace after
we
meals.
wash and we ate bread, we are required to recite the grace after meals, Birchat Hamazon. That's the biblical mitzvah. The blessings before eating, which we talked about in previous lessons, that's a rabbinical creation. To be mindful that the food we're eating has a spark of godliness. That is the same reason why they instituted that before we do a mitzvah, we should recite a blessing. So before you put up a mezuzah on the door, you recite a blessing. But it doesn't say anywhere in the Torah that you have to recite a blessing. It just says you do the mitzvah. So why do you recite the blessing? For mindfulness. But what is the text of the blessing? Yeah.
So like nowadays, people don't speak Hebrew, especially Jews. So would it be more important, let's say if you're shaking the love with someone, to, explain to them instead of, let's say, you only have their attention for a less amount of time, or you yourself are only going to give X amount, would it be more important to learn about what you're doing and be mindful of it instead of saying the blessing, because I feel like the blessing doesn't mean so much to a lot of people.
Let me repeat the question. The question is for those people that are not familiar with Hebrew and they recite the blessing, is it better if they recite it in English? I would say this, that what I usually do, let's say if I have a lulav and etrog and I want to share the mitzvah with someone, I will do the Hebrew blessing, but I will also recite it in English with them so they should understand what they're saying. The idea is that the blessing has to be one of mindfulness, but there is a charm doing it in Hebrew because that's the original language. With a blessing, once you learn the meaning of the bracha, and all the mitzvahs, in fact, all the blessings of the mitzvahs have the same beginning. Not only do they have the same beginning, they have the same middle. It's only the end that's different. So for instance, give a look. When you wash your hands and you recite the blessing, you say, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al nitilat yadayim. Blessed are you, God, our Lord, the King of the universe, who has sanctified us or consecrated us with his commandments and commanded us to wash our hands. Nitilat yadayim. Now listen to the blessing over the lulav. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al nitilat lulav. So the words are almost the same except the last word. Or for mezuzah, likvo mezuzah. So the general idea is something that people have. So what I would do is spend a moment or two explaining to them what the blessing means. However, with Birchat Hamazon, because it's a biblical mitzvah, and you have to be mindful of what you're reciting, I would say that it's better to recite it in the language that you know. But going back to this particular statement here, so what he's saying over here is that when you look at the text of the blessing, it says, blessed are you who sanctified us or consecrated us, kiddushanu with his mitzvot. In Hebrew, the term kiddush means both sanctification and betrothal. In other words, the rabbi that officiates at a marriage is called Mesader Kiddushin, the one that organizes the betrothal. And the Ramban says that the reason why betrothal is called Kiddushin is because it's a holy act. I want to stop here for a second. The word kadosh, which means holy, also means to dedicate, which is the idea of consecration. Even in the modern Hebrew language, if you're going to take a table and you're going to dedicate it for a certain use, you say, lahakdish, I have dedicated this for this particular purpose. And consecration and sanctification is also the same concept of dedication. So remember, the word kadosh is to separate it from the rest and say, this is dedicated for something special. Betrothal is the same thing. It's a holy act, but more than that, the couple is betrothed to each other. They're dedicated to each other to the exclusion of everybody else. That's why when the rabbi is reciting the blessing, it's absolutely important for him to say, this is they're betrothed to each other to the exclusion of everybody else. But nevertheless, it has the word kiddush. So a mitzvah is kiddush and betrothal is kiddush, is holy. So he says, through performing a mitzvah, we are bound to God like a man betrothing his wife for the sake of being intimately united with each other. Now let me stop here because every word here counts. This is also a legal concept in the chuppah. The legal concept in the chuppah is that when the marriage is, the betrothal is taking place, which is called the Siddur Kedushin, it has to be with the intent that they must be intimate with each other. But if they plan not to be intimate with each other, it's a question whether they can truly be betrothed. For that reason, right after the chuppah, there's this ritual known as the yichud room. The yichud room is the room where they seclude alone. And what happens is that the couple goes into a room which is either windowless or has thick drapes, curtains on it. And the witnesses actually have to go into the room to check that there's nobody there and nobody can see what's going on, or that there is no surveillance camera there. And then they close the door and the couple remains there after the chuppah ceremony, before they go out to the wedding, by themselves. Usually they sit down, they relax, they break their fast, they talk, whatever it is. But the point is that that's the intimate part, that they're all alone. And of course, the intimate part that comes later. But the point of the matter is, why is it so important here to say intimacy? Because what he's trying to say here is that the relationship of a mitzvah not only bonds us that we're connected, but that we're intimately connected with each other, just like a couple. As the Torah states regarding the bonding of the first human couple, he shall cleave to his wife and they shall become one flesh. Not only do they become one flesh physically, but they become one flesh emotionally, mentally, spiritually, on every level. The souls also bond together. And this is the meaning of Kiddushin. So every time we do a mitzvah, we're being intimate with God. When we study the Torah or perform a commandment, we achieve a similar, indeed an infinitely deeper and truer unity between our soul along with all of its elements and God's absolute infinite light. And in fact, it's even a greater level of unity than the unity between a couple, because we're dealing with God and God is infinite. So the connection with God is an infinite connection. So what we're seeing here is that the idea of a mitzvah is so powerful that it lifts us. And being that we're close to Passover, I do want you to turn to page 205, and we're going to go back to the regular text, because this is very nice for Passover, a good preparation. This is also taken from the Tanya, chapter 46. It's a long reading, but it's still worthwhile. So he's speaking over there that through a mitzvah, one can reach the level of love with God. So he says, take to heart the verse that's taken from Mishlei, as water reflects a face, so does the heart of man reflect another heart. This means, just as water reflects the very image and features that a person presents before it, so too, a heart that is loyal in its love for another awakens a corresponding loving response, cementing the mutual love and loyalty. This is especially true when the love is observable. This is a universal law of human nature that applies even if the two people involved are equal. In other words, they're the same. How much more so does this law apply if a great and mighty king shows immense love for a commoner who is scorned, lowly, covered in filth, lying in a dunghill? Imagine a king leaving his royal palace and accompanied by his entire retinue of ministers. He approaches the commoner. The king extracts him from the dunghill and brings him to the innermost chamber of his royal palace, a room where no servant or minister is permitted entry. There, the king embraces and kisses him and shares with him the closest of friendship, a spiritual attachment of the heart and soul. Just to understand this, the reason that we're called commoners is because we're finite. And finite beings are not at the level of spirituality as God. So compared to God, we're a commoner. But generally speaking, we would think about the prince who finds his bride and he sees this special beauty in her, but she is a prisoner in a dungeon, and he frees her and he embraces her. So it's the same sense here. So how great will the love of this commoner and lowly individual for the king? How great will that be? He will most certainly be attached to the king with heart and soul, with infinite heartfelt sincerity. Even if his heart is made of stone, it will surely melt and become water. In other words, it will become liquefied, and it will pour with soulful longing for the love of the king. Now, all of this is precisely exactly as described God has done with us, but it is infinitely greater because his greatness defies comprehension, and he pervades all worlds and transcends all worlds. In other words, he's coming from a much higher place than a king coming from his palace or even from his throne, because we're talking about infinite greatness of God. And God disregarded the higher and lower worlds. What does it mean he disregarded the whole higher and lower worlds? He said, I'm not going to have a relationship with the angels or the souls that are occupying the higher worlds, like the Garden of Eden and their inhabitants. He chose none else but Israel, his nation. He brought them out of Egypt, the most decadent place on earth, a place of spiritual filth and impurity, as the Torah says. He did not send an angel to take them out. Rather, he alone in his majesty and glory descended there, as God said, I have come down to rescue them. He took them out to bring them near him with true closeness and unity, to share with them a soul connection. This connection includes the kisses mouth to mouth, which occurs when we speak words of God, namely the halacha. So we're studying the code of Jewish law. That is the will of God, and that's as if we're kissing God on the mouth. The fusion of spirits occurs when we comprehend the Torah and know his will and wisdom, all of which is truly one with God. The fusion of spirits is when we take our mind and invest in it in Torah study. It's God's wisdom, so it connects with us. And also embracing, what's the embrace? Which occurs when we use our 248 limbs to fulfill the 248 mitzvahs of the Torah, which symbolize God's organs. Thus, when fulfilling them, we embrace God's body. We're going to go, because remember, we talked about the general view of a mitzvah, that any mitzvah, and what's common in a mitzvah, is that we're fulfilling God's command. Now we're going to focus more, zoom in, so to speak, and narrow our focus on the particularity of the mitzvah, why the mitzvah is important. By the way, there's a joke that they have here when we talk about intent and non-intent, body and soul. A family invited a few people over for dinner, and one of them was a photographer, and he was just impressed with the food and the presentation, and he used his camera and he took pictures. And obviously, because he knew how to take pictures, they came out beautifully. And the hostess said to him, when she saw the pictures, you must have a beautiful camera. You must have a fantastic camera. To which he said, thank you. But then before he left, he said, you must have good pots and pans. The idea is that anyone that takes pictures knows, if you practice a little in photography, of course you need a good photographer, but you need a good eye to be able to frame the picture, see what you want to see in the picture. That's the intent. The action is the vessel. The same thing is true in a mitzvah. We have the vessel, which is the mitzvah, but we need to have the intent that's there. But that's the general intent. Now we need to go to the particular intent. Now, in the particular intent, there's a little introduction as well, and that's taken from Nachmanides. By the way, there was a question that was asked before, where do we have the mitzvah of reciting the grace after meals? It's actually in the benching itself. It's taken from the book of Deuteronomy. When Moses speaks about the virtue of the land of Israel, And he says, when you will settle the land, you will eat, you will be satiated, and you will bless God your Lord. And from there, we learn that the only time that you actually are required to recite the grace after meals is if you're satiated. So if you're eating just a little crumb or a little taste and you're not satiated, you're not required to recite the blessing. And the rabbis have measured what it takes the average person to feel satiated. Okay, let's give a look what it says here in Achmanides. Page 189, text 5. Our sages state, this is taken from the Medrash, the mitzvahs were given only to refine the person. In other words, we don't know what the true intent of the mitzvah is. We don't know why God gave the mitzvah. It's God's will. God is infinite. His desire is infinite. But we do know that the mitzvahs have a profound effect on us, that they refine us. The purpose of the mitzvah is not to benefit God, but rather to benefit humanity. Let's stop here a second. What does it mean not to benefit God? Usually, when someone in power asks you to do something for them, it's because they want to benefit. If a king is asking you to serve in a particular government position, it's because the king needs someone to do it for you. But when we speak about God, you can't apply that reasoning to God. Why can't you apply that reasoning to God? Because God is not deficient. God lacks nothing. To God, the action and potential is all the same thing. You can't say that God is missing the human interaction, because if you're saying that, then it's an imperfection in God. Then you're saying God is deficient. And since God is all powerful, you have to come to the conclusion that it's not because God needs something, it's because God desires it. Why God desires it, even the greatest scholars, even the greatest Rebbes and Hasidus say, there's no answer for that. It comes from the essence of God. Maybe when Mashiach comes, we'll get the answer why. But God forbid to say that God is doing it because without it, God is lacking something. You can't say that. So therefore, Nachmanides is saying that the purpose of the mitzvahs is not to benefit God, but rather to benefit humanity, humankind. One thing is to keep them safe from harm. What does it mean to keep them safe from harm? The mitzvahs are there to give us a way that we should not harm each other. Like there's a mitzvah that we learned about the roof around the wall around the flat roof, or things of that nature. Or to shield us from negative beliefs. Negative beliefs can be idol worship. Negative beliefs can be impulsive ideas, which are detrimental to our humanity, but they give us a certain instantaneous pleasure, but we don't think about the results. And the Torah tells us those are not good. On base character traits, or to remind us of the miracles and the wonders of the Creator. We spoke about Passover. The reason we eat matzah is to remember the fact that we were slaves in Egypt and that God liberated us and took us out of slavery. Or there are some mitzvahs that make us know God. In other words, through these mitzvahs, we're able to understand and have a relationship with God, like tefillin and mezuzah, as we're going to soon see. The Midrash employs the term litzaref, tzaref, for refining, which usually refers to refining silver. This informs us that the mitzvahs refine mortals in a similar way to the way a silversmith refines silver. Silver refinement is a purposeful task done for the sake of removing all impurities. Similarly, the mitzvahs are designed to remove every harmful belief from our hearts, to inform us of the truth, and to enable us to constantly be mindful of the truth. So here we're now looking, besides the fact that we're doing the mitzvah and we're mindful of the mitzvah, that it's God's intent and we're connecting with God, we also are mindful that there is a human benefit here. There's a benefit for us, depending on what the mitzvah is. And each mitzvah carries within it that characteristic that helps us. Maimonides takes it a step further in his famous book, The Guide to the Perplexed. And The Guide to Perplexed, by the way, is a unique writing of the Rambam, which is different than any of the other writings, even of halacha, because in the Guide to the Perplexed, it was an answer to the challenge of philosophers, and he was bringing out the rationale of Torah and mitzvahs. So over there he says in text 6, page 190, each of the 613 commandments exist to communicate a correct view or to dismiss an unhealthy view, to communicate a rule of justice or to ward off an injustice, to endow people with a noble moral quality or to warn them against a negative moral quality. It's interesting that the Rambam writes in that Moreh Nevuchim that in general, the first thing that the Torah is trying to do is to establish that there should be a peaceful world. And he writes over there that nations should be able to have their independence and one nation should not gobble up another nation. And that one should respect the other nation with the nation's laws. There should be freedom, a certain level of democracy. That's number one. That's what the Torah demands. The second thing is that the Torah demands is to lift us to a higher level, that we should recognize that there is actually holiness in the world. So here you have a benefit that when you're doing mitzvahs, the mitzvahs are there to make you mindful that every act in the world has a holiness ascribed to it, and it trains us. And for that reason, a lot of people misunderstand Judaism. We asked the question in the beginning of the class about the exercise. Is action more important? Is faith more important? Now, in some religions, faith is the pillar of the entire religion. It's the underlying cardinal fundamental premise of everything. And action should just come as a result, but there's no specific action. You have to be decent, you have to be nice, and all the other nice things that it says there. Some religions have even a few more commandments. You give a look in Judaism, of course, Judaism has the idea of faith. In fact, the first thing that the Rambam writes is more than faith. You have to have a knowing relationship with God. The foundation of all foundations and the pillar of all wisdom is to know that there is a God. But yet, Judaism has so many commandments. You talk about 613 commandments, 365 don'ts, and 248 do's. And even if you take out all the mitzvahs that can only be done in the Beit HaMikdash, you still have a host of a lot of mitzvahs. And some people say, hey, this is so overbearing. Why is God interested in controlling every part of my life in such a dictatorship? Comes along the Rambam and the Ramban, and they say that's not what it's about. It's about making every aspect of your life meaningful and holy, and it's protecting you. So if you are prohibited from engaging in an illicit relationship, it's there to protect the integrity of your life and the integrity of your marriage. If you are prohibited from eating a certain kind of food, it's because spiritually ingesting that food is harmful to your spiritual life. It's not just there to control you, it is a concept of holiness. And if on Shabbat you get together and you observe the Shabbat and you eat food on Shabbat for the holiness of Shabbat, it elevates the world. So every physical activity, even the most mundane actions of life, are holy actions. We spoke about betrothal. In another place, it says that the betrothal is called kiddushin because the act of marriage is considered to be a mitzvah, a holy act. Okay, so this takes it a little bit more. Now we're going to go to another thing, and that is that when we talk about meditation and mitzvahs, the question is what comes first? The inspiration to do the mitzvah or the act? Conventional wisdom says first comes the inspiration, then comes the act. Judaism says it's actually in reverse. First comes the act and then comes the inspiration. That's a total paradigm shift. You give a look when the Jewish people stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, and God was going to give them the Torah. God asked them, sends Moshe, are they going to accept it or not? What is their response? We will do and we will listen. We will do and then we'll study the meaning of it. So the reverse is true. There's a story that a rabbi once asked one of his congregants, why don't you do mitzvot? And he says, because I don't believe in God. He says the opposite is true. Because you don't do mitzvahs, that's why you don't believe in God. But if you do mitzvahs, you will train yourself how to believe in God. Imun, exercise, emunah, the word of faith, is connected to the Hebrew word imun, which means to train yourself, exercise. When someone is training for a marathon, they go through imunim. When soldiers are training for battle, they're called imunim. Imunim is rooted in the word emunah. Emunah's faith is something that you actually make it your habit. And let's give a look the way the Sefer HaChinuch actually says it. Text number 7, where he says actions influence attitude. So he says the following, and now, my child, I will enlighten you to appreciate the Torah and its precepts. You're influenced by your behavior, and your feelings and thoughts consistently follow your actions, whether for the positive or for the negative. Your actions have the power to overcome the negative inclination within you, since the attitudes of your heart are influenced by your behaviors. This is actually something which is discussed in science as well. If a person slouches their shoulders and they frown and they sit like that in a negative position, they'll develop a negative attitude. But if a person stands tall and straight and smiles for 10 seconds, they'll develop a positive attitude. There was a Dr. Amy Cuddy that gave a TED Talk, and it was one of the most watched TED Talks. And she basically called the TED Talk power posing. The way you pose your body, that's the mood that you have. In other words, you're creating a body language that creates your mood. And actually, there was a lot of criticism against her talk, but she later came and defended it. The idea is that when we do the act in itself lightens the mood. The truth of the matter is that even if there's a famous story with a very powerful person who was wealthy, who was actually a ruler, and he was always upset, he was always sad, he was never happy, he was never happy. And he hired every kind of entertainer to make him happy. He had clowns, he had comedians, and momentarily he had a laugh, but as soon as they left, his default position was unhappiness. And he couldn't break the depression. And one time he was walking out and he saw a man carrying a heavy load and was breaking his back. And all of a sudden, for whatever reason, even though he wasn't inspired, he just said, the sense of decency hit him, let me help you. And he started to help this person, even though he never did any menial labor. And he started helping this person carry the load. And all of a sudden, he felt a sense of happiness, a sense of fulfillment. He was doing something with his body to help another human being. And that gave him the happiness. The same thing is here. Of course, if somebody is motivated with passion and they're doing it, a blessing on their head. But the reality is that the action of mitzvahs, the meditation of mitzvahs, the meditative quality of mitzvah is the action helps the meditation. So when we talk about the purpose of mitzvah, in fact, give a look how the Rebbe says it on page 192, text number 8. The Rebbe says the main focus within Judaism is action. As we mentioned before, that deed is higher than study, which entails practically fulfilling the mitzvahs. At the same time, each Torah-based action has an effect on the person's character. Studying Torah and fulfilling mitzvahs refine the mind and emotions, as repeatedly emphasized in the works of Maimonides, who serves as a guide for the perplexed of his generations and continues to serve as a guide for truth seekers in subsequent eras. So what he's saying over here is that when you get into the habit of action, now, if you're just doing it by rote, then it's wrong. But if you're mindful about it, the action in itself helps you lift you in the proper way. And I'll give you an example. We mentioned this in previous classes. One of the things that we do when we wake up in the morning, before we even wash our hands, is we recite a statement. And that is the Moda Ani. I offer my thanks to you, the King of the universe, that with your great mercy you've restored my soul to me. And if you say it with a mindful way, just the fact that you are saying it because you know it's a ritual to say and you're thinking about it it gives you a different focus for the day. When you're waking up in the morning and you're lying in bed, you think about positive thoughts and you're thinking about you have the potential to do great things today and that God is with you. So the action is causing that ability to do it. If you look on page 193, we're going to study some mitzvahs. There are 5. They highlight 3 because they are worried we won't have enough time. But if you highlight the first 3, charity, which is tzedakah, there must be a meditative agenda for that. What is the benefit of giving charity? Not the benefit of the poor person receiving it, but what's the benefit to the donor? That's question number 1. Why in the 10 commandments does God command us to honor our parents? Honor your father and mother. What do we benefit out of it? What they benefit out of it, we know. What do we benefit out of it? And then it says also in the 10 commandments, remember or observe the Shabbat as a holy day. What do we get out of it? And then if we have time, we'll also talk about the mitzvah of the donning of the tefillin every morning and putting up the mezuzah. So we're not going to keep this as a secret from you because we're going to study some text on it. So let's give a look in text 9. It's also taken from the Sefer HaChinuch. By the way, he uses the term lend rather than giving to the poor. I just want to give a little background to that. Maimonides writes the 8 degrees of charity. I'm sure people have heard about that, what the 8 degrees of charity are. And the higher degree is that you're giving and the receiver doesn't know who it is, and the giver doesn't know who the receiver is and all of that, the recipient is. But then it says the highest level of tzedakah is to give a loan to someone to let them establish themselves on their feet. In other words, of course, if the person needs charity, give them charity. But if a person comes for a loan, they're not asking for a loan for $5. They're usually asking for a loan to be able to start a business. They're asking a loan to be able to establish themselves. And the fact that you have the trust in them and you respect their dignity, that you're seeing them as an equal, that is the highest level. That's why he says lending, but it means all of the tzedakah. It says the root of the mitzvah to lend to the poor is that God desired that his creatures become accustomed and train themselves in the characteristics of kindness and mercy. These are praiseworthy characteristics. And through training their bodies to act according to the positive traits, they will be worthy of receiving goodness. For as we have explained, goodness and blessings fall exclusively on the good. So let me stop here a second. What he's asking a question here is that if God is perfect, why did God create an imperfect world? And why did God create haves and have-nots? And the answer is to train those that have in the character of kindness, of caring for others. And the caring for others expresses itself in 2 ways. One is to give them what they need, but then there's another thing. The Alter Rebbe actually writes about this, that even if you wrote at the beginning of the year or at the end of the year a big check that gives the charity and the charity is taking care of all the needs, there is still a value of every day putting a coin or a dollar into the tzedakah box. Because what it's doing is it's training you that every day you should do goodness. The Rebbe in the 80s also instituted, and he asked that every person should affix a tzedakah box in their kitchen. And he didn't just want it that it should be in the kitchen, but it should be affixed, that every time you prepare a meal, you take a coin and put it in the tzedakah box, and you use that money to feed the poor. So while you're preparing food for yourself, you're thinking about the needy. This is the concept, training yourself to be kind. If it were not for this benefit, God would provide the poor with their needs without us. Rather, out of sheer kindness of the blessed God made us his messengers so that we can become meritorious through the process. Now, the obvious question that comes is that the poor person will come to God and say, why did you choose me to be poor and the other guy to be wealthy? It should be just the opposite. So there are 2 answers to it. Answer number 1 is that the Talmud says that more than the poor person receives, the giver receives. Everybody is a giver and everybody is a receiver. The giver gives a blessing, the receiver receives, the giver can give from their wisdom. And then there's another thing, which actually we learned in another JLI, and that has to do with the idea of reincarnation. The very possible that the soul of the poor person in the previous lifetime was a very wealthy person. And at that time, this wealthy person was selfish and never gave, was a miser. And therefore, to rectify his soul, he had to be on the other end. He was born now as a poor person. So now he feels the pain of what it means to be poor and asking others. And it could be that it's also the rich person was poor in a previous lifetime. And he was always saying, if I were rich, I would take care of all the poor. And God says, okay, now in your new life that you're reincarnated, you're going to be wealthy. Let's see how you do. So we have to understand that you can't just look at the here and now. You have to look at the whole big picture. But anyways, nevertheless, the idea of tzedakah is to actually train us. Now, what's the idea of honoring our parents? Honoring our parents is so important, kibud av v'em, that it's included in the 10 Commandments, which means to say it's a general mitzvah. And you also know that the way the 10 Commandments were given, they were given 5 and 5, 2 tablets, right? 2 square tablets, one next to the other. What parallels the mitzvah of I'm your God, your Lord, and there's only one God, which is the highest level of monotheism? What parallels that is honoring your parents. So much so that the sages say that honoring your parents is on par with believing in one God, the highest level of the mitzvah. So what's the connection there? So the chinuch goes on to say, and he says, the root of the commandment for an individual to honor their father and mother is that it is fitting for a person to acknowledge and return kindness to those who provided goodness and to avoid becoming a selfish ingrate, an evil and repulsive attribute in the eyes of God and mortals alike. This mitzvah is designed to spur us to contemplate that our parents are the material cause of our existence in this world. It is therefore truly fitting to honor them in every way and to provide them with every benefit that is within our ability, for they brought us into the world and also toiled on our behalf in numerous ways when we were young. I remember when we were students in rabbinical school, we heard the story that there was a young man who was a groom to get married, and his father was a very busy lawyer and was just busy taking care of clients. And the few days before the wedding, he did not take any clients, no appointments, and he spent the entire time with his son, making sure that he has all of his needs, making sure he has the garments, the apartment, whatever he needed. He just took care of him on the best way, gave him everything that he needed, that the groom was able to walk into the wedding like a mensch. But before the groom was led to the chuppah, the father turned to the son and he said, okay, son, I've done all this for you. Now, how are you going to repay me for this? And the son said, I will do the same thing for my child. And the father smiled and he said, that's what I wanted to hear. In other words, that we recognize that what our parents did for us, we should do it for others, but how much more so to do it for our parents? That's why, according to the Talmud and the Code of Jewish Law, we have an obligation to take care of our parents. If our parents are aging and they need our help, it is imperative upon us to take care of them. It's imperative upon us to feed them. Not only that, the law says that if there's a community fund giving out money to the poor and the children are in town, so if their children are not in town and they can't get to their children, then the community fund has to support them. And remember, in the olden days, you didn't have the ability to wire money like you have today or to take care of things long distance. But if the children are in town, are in town, the communal fund should not give to the parents anything as long as the children can afford it, because it's their obligation. It's theirs. They have the obligation to do that. That's part of it. So the idea of honoring is not to be an ingrate. Same thing is true that it's on par with God. We get all the gifts from God, so we have to do that as well. Now we're going to come to Shabbat. Why is Shabbat so important? Now, a lot of people don't understand Shabbat because if you look at the verses in the Torah, it says God created the world in 6 days, and the seventh day he rested, and therefore we're now required to rest. That is a level that you explain to a child in kindergarten. But as we grow older, we realize that there's much more to the Shabbat. Shabbat is not just about a day of rest. Shabbat is a day of spiritual ascendancy. It's a day of becoming one with God. It's the idea of recognizing the creator in the creation. When we are involved in the creation 6 days a week, and we're following the news, or we're following the stock market, or we're following whatever profession we're in, or whatever business we're in, we're so caught up with doing what we have to do and producing. Shabbat comes, you can't do it. You have to think about God. You have to think about the holiness of the world. So the Chinuch says the same thing in text 11. The root of this commandment is to abstain from work on Shabbat, that we should free ourselves from our occupations to honor the day of Shabbat, thereby instilling within ourselves belief in God's creation of the universe. For this belief is the cord to which every foundation of our religion is attached. So actually, the Shabbat is like the core of the wheel. The Shabbat is the core of the whole weekday. The Shabbat is the idea that we work to reveal the presence of God in the world. That's why it translates that the Talmud says that there were certain sages that every day, if they would see something nice in the weekday, they would say, I want to put it away for Shabbat. And if they saw something nicer the next day, they would say, okay, I want to put this away for Shabbat. The point of the matter is that it wasn't just to honor Shabbat and say it's God's day and therefore we're not going to work. It is the day that we are entering into the realm of God. The world is ascending to a higher level on Shabbat. So Shabbat is not just to honor God because God created the world and God wanted a day of rest. It is the day that we're ascending to be one with Hashem, to recognize what the whole purpose of creation is all about. And that's why it says more than the Jews have done to keep the Shabbat has done to keep the Jewish people. There is a book that I read as a child, written by a Russian Jewish author, survivor of the Gulag, that he called Subotu. And basically, it's a very interesting book because in the time of the purge, when Stalin was arresting people right, left, and center and killing them or sending them to the labor camps. So this particular person was arrested as well in 1938 for some trumped up crime. And he was a bookkeeper by profession. And he knew, he was a Chabad Chassid. The Chabad Chassidim had a discipline that if there's going to be one thing that they're going to accept that's going to become their avenue through which they're going to keep everything in Judaism. And he chose Shabbat. Now imagine being in a Russian prison keeping Shabbat. But he managed to do it until they discovered it, and they punished him that he should spend another extra 10 years, instead of 10 years, 20 years in prison. But he survived. And what's interesting is that when he came out of Russia in the 60s, he came to the Rebbe and he told the Rebbe, they stole 20 years of my life. And the Rebbe meditated and thought, and he said, we will not count it. And he lived to be 100 years old with the full capacity. Active, he lived in Israel and he was active in the community. Just a fascinating story. But in this book, he writes what he did to keep the Shabbat under all circumstances. We're going to go now to the two other mitzvot. They're common mitzvahs. One is the tefillin that we put on. And the tefillin, what's the benefit of tefillin? If you give a look in the prayer book on the meditation that we have to do before we put on the tefillin, which is on our arm and on our head, it says it's obligatory upon us to harness our minds the heart to the mind, to remember all the miracles that God did for us, and to remember that we stand in the presence of God. So again, the Chinuch explains it. Amongst those commandments from God that are for the sake of molding thoughts in order to serve in the purity is the commandment of tefillin. Tefillin are to be placed on the body in locations corresponding to the brain and the heart, organs that are referred to as the seats of intellect and perception. Laying tefillin and contemplating their purpose leads to dedicating all thoughts to the good, and leads to constantly remembering to be careful to calibrate all deeds in a righteous and justice way. The next mitzvah is a more common mitzvah, and that is the mezuzah. Why are we putting a mezuzah? Some people think because it's there to protect the home. And in fact, on the outside of the mezuzah, there's a shin, and the shin stands for one of God's names, which is Shaddai, which is spelled with 3 Hebrew letters, Shin Dalet Yud, and the Zohar says that Shin Dalet Yud is an acronym for Shomer Dalet Yisrael, the guardian of the doors of Israel. The Rambam comes along and says that might be nice, but that's not the real reason of putting up a mezuzah. The mezuzah is at the entrance and exit of the door. It's at the doorpost. So when you walk into the house, you see the mezuzah, and when you leave the house, you see the mezuzah. What is that? So text 13, page 197. We must be careful to observe the mitzvah of mezuzah, for it is an obligation that is constantly incumbent upon everyone. Through observing this precept, whenever we enter or leave our homes, we encounter the symbol of God's unity and recall our love for Him. This activity shakes us awake from our spiritual slumber, our obsession with material vanities, so that we recognize that nothing we gain lasts forever except the knowledge of the Creator of the universe. This will spur us to regain proper mindful awareness and make upright decisions. So in other words, the house that you live in is now a temple. It's a holy place. When you enter into it, you're conscientious of the fact that the divine presence is here. And that's why it's a custom to kiss the mezuzah, or some have the custom of touching the mezuzah. Not necessarily kissing it, but touching means to be aware. Touching what you enter and then when you leave. Because let's say you live very spiritually and Jewishly in the house, but when you leave, you just want to mingle with the masses, assimilate, and you just don't want to stand out, and you become like everybody else. Sorry. So the point of the mezuzah is to remind us that even when we go out, we have the holiness. So here what we've done is 3 things with the meditation of the mitzvah. Number 1, we've introduced that a mitzvah is not the action itself, which is the body. There has to be the thought that goes into it, the betrothal between God and the people. We become one. We're united. We're united not because God needs something, but because God wants to have a relationship with us. So if you do the mitzvah without intent, even though you did the act, it's like giving flowers or giving a gift to someone without thinking about it. The most embarrassing thing is that if somebody gives you a trinket and you say, "Here, I don't need it," you take it. That's not called giving a gift. That's not called having a relationship. Having a relationship means that there's intent, there's passion, there's meaning in it. So that's the meditation. The second thing that we learned is that it's not just a general idea, but each mitzvah is there to refine us. And the third thing that we learned is that the habit of doing the mitzvah actually refines us and creates the system of belief, creates the system of things that we do. That's why in Judaism, action comes first. Not only the actions of charity, but any ritual you accept, you do it, you study it, but the action is very important. For those people that hesitate, then at the end of the day, if they're doing it only because their mind understands it, then it's not because of a relationship with God. It's all about themselves. It's like the story, with love. When somebody says to someone else, "I love you because you make me feel good," that's not called true love. It's love, but it's not the ultimate love. The ultimate love is you're doing it for that person, not for yourself. The test is, even if it negates you or if it's something that deprives you, like the fellow that was going to cut up the carp, and he says, I love carp, and the carp says, you don't love me, you love yourself. It doesn't have to be to the point where someone dies for the other person, but the idea is that we're doing it because we want to have the relationship. And if a relationship is truly for the sense of a relationship, then selfishness has no place, because selfishness is about myself. So the mitzvah is making us mindful, and this is what the meditation is all about. I know I told you that we have questions, time for questions. If anyone has a question, please either in the chat or ask the question. But I do want to say something that is actually very important when it comes to meditation and why action is important. There's a story, and I mentioned the story once before, but it's worthwhile repeating it, of a scholar who had studied the depth of Torah. And he studied the meaning of every mitzvah, and every mitzvah was important to him. And one day, he gets a knock on the door, and his wife wasn't home. And he opens up, and there is a person that is starving, saying, I'm famished. I haven't eaten in 3 days. I didn't have anything. I feel like I'm about to collapse. I'm going to die. I need some food. And the scholar is saying, what an opportunity God gave me. Wow. Do you know what it means to restore life to the poor person that hasn't eaten? Do you know what happens in the heavens, how the angels dance, and how all the upper worlds and the lower worlds are actually bound by that? And he goes into this whole meditation. By the time he finishes the meditation and goes to the kitchen to get a piece of bread, the guy is no longer alive. So we use it as an example that, meditation is important, but it has to lead to action. Action is what's most important, but the action has to be meaningful. Unfortunately, I remember one time I was in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is going back in 1977 or 75. And I was sitting with a very well-to-do Jewish person, and I brought a pair of tefillin. And I said, I'd like you to put on the tefillin and recite the Shema. And he says to me, Rabbi, I don't need that. That's made for people that have no feeling in their heart. God lives in my heart. I don't need to do the act. Which that's the opposite of what we're learning here. Of course, you need the meditation and you need God living in your heart. But God living in your heart is not enough. There has to be the expression, because ultimately, that's what God wanted. God wanted that the physical deed should be done, that your flesh, that your being should actually be refined through it and elevated through it. So if it's in the heart, it just remains in the heart. It doesn't go anywhere. So when we talk about meditation in Judaism, meditation, again, reframes the way the mind thinks, and it's positive, and there's a lot of thinking. In fact, in Chabad, the idea of studying the deeper esoteric aspects of godliness and meditating on it and thinking about it and studying it. There's a story with the Rebbe Maharash, the fourth Chabad Rebbe, that he was speaking to one of his disciples, and he wanted to know exactly what he does before davening and after davening, what he does at night as far as the meditation. And then he said, but when do you do the action? There needs to be the action as well. Yes, somebody asked, I would say, please email Rabbi Cohen or Deb, and we will have all the forms for you to get the credits if you need to have the credits, the accreditation. Nevertheless, I still have a few moments if anyone has any questions.
Could you please provide Rabbi Cohen's email address?
Absolutely. It's Rabbi Cohen at chabadnc.org. We make it easy. There are also some interesting readings in the back which help us. I just want to reiterate that the attitude that we have towards mitzvot sometimes is interesting, that a person could be overwhelmed when you hear there's 613 commandments. Of those 365 don'ts and 248 do's. And you say, how? I'm just overwhelmed. I can never be perfect. So the answer to that is the following. That number one, you need to acknowledge, we all need to acknowledge that they're all there and they're all God-given. But on the other hand, we also recognize our capabilities and we recognize what we can and what we can't do. If somebody says, I am going to accept the mitzvahs, I'm going to do every mitzvah that I can. That is flying in the sky. That doesn't do anything. Rather start with one, internalize it, and when it becomes part of your routine, part of your nature, you bonded with it, then you add another one. And then you work that way as well, because that's more meaningful than saying, I'm going to take up everything. In fact, when somebody makes a resolution without the details, let's say if you make a resolution, I want to lose weight, nothing is going to happen with it. You're going to go on a diet for a week and after that it's broken. But if you say, I'm going to lose 20 pounds and I'm going to try to lose the 20 pounds in so many months, and this is my plan, then you have success with it. So somebody asked the question, can you explain how reading Tehillim affects this world? That's very interesting. Anytime you recite words of Torah, you're refining the environment, because the words of Torah are very holy and they're spiritual. But there's a unique characteristic in Tehillim, as most of the Tehillim was written by King David, and he wrote it as a supplication and a prayer from the heart. And the supplication and the prayer from the heart is godly words. So the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Chabad Rebbe, said that reciting the Tehillim is like a Kiddush cup. You know that when you recite the Kiddush Friday night or Shabbat, you're supposed to lift the cup at least a handbreadth above the table. In other words, you're supposed to lift yourself a little higher. So it says when you recite the Tehillim is actually lifting you to a higher place, to a higher world. And the reciting of the Tehillim is so expressive, they're divine words, so therefore it has an effect. Not only that, it says that when there are people that are going through a challenge, they're going through a hard time, they recite Tehillim, or you recite Tehillim for their sake. That is an old proven thing of what we do. Okay, any other questions? Please don't be shy. By the way, I will give you my email as well, so that if anyone has any questions and you want to further explore some of the concepts that we talked about, you can always write to me. It's rabbi@chabadnc.org or Rabbi Groner at chabadnc.org. I want to take this opportunity to thank everybody for joining the class. There is a review quiz. I don't know if you have it, but I'm just going to ask some questions to see how many of you remember. Who was the first Jew to meditate? I mentioned it today in passing today. Was it Moses, Abraham, Ramdas, or the Baal Shem Tov?
Abraham?
Correct. Second question. What does hitbonenut mean? A, an exotic nut from Israel. Cognitive meditation. Facilitative meditation. When you hit your funny bone. Hitbonenut. You should remember that because we spoke about that tonight as well. It's cognitive meditation. Can we shape the reality outside of us through political lobbying, positivity meditation? We can't. Banging a gong and lighting incense.
Create meditative creativity. Well, the second one.
Positivity meditation. Very good. Okay. Every part of our lives can be sacred because God recreates the world intentionally every moment. God is within every detail of the universe. Everything happens for a divine purpose, all the above.
All of the above.
Very good. The three garments of the soul are shirt, pants, and shoes, intelligence, emotion, and action, thought, speech, and action, bone, skin, and flesh. That's a tricky one, but the answer is, it's the third, thought, speech, and action. Jewish meditation is primarily a tool to make money, have a mystical experience, understand abstract and spiritual concepts, and develop a spiritual awareness, or make Judaism more attractive.
Develop a spiritual awareness.
Very good. This is a funny one. In which city does Rabbi Label Wolf live? The one that did all the meditation? In Cape Town, South Africa? Melbourne, Australia?
Melbourne.
That is correct. Okay. We'll leave it at that because it's 9 o'clock. I'd like to thank everybody for joining, and hopefully you'll join us for the next JLI, which is going to be equally exciting. And it should just be a happy Purim, as next week is Purim. We're going to have a big Purim event here called the Country Purim in the Country. And you can go on our website at chabadnc.org. You can register for that. And hopefully we'll be able to rejoice together with good news in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Guys,
Thank you,
Yeah.
Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Tough questions, Rip.
Thank you.